What compels me to play open-world games? I think it has to do with a single moment, always near the beginning. It's the moment in which the game unleashes the shackles and lets you go anywhere. Maybe a loosely defined direction has been established, but that's more of a suggestion than anything. Really, the moment is meant to awe you with the sheer scope and size of what's on offer. A chance for you to say, I can't believe something this full exists. It's at this point in time where the only thing you can imagine are the endless possibilities. The challenge of an open-world game, then, is fulfilling the promise of endless possibilities. An impossible practicality, of course, but some get closer than others. There's an unfortunate pattern that afflicts many open worlds, whereby because the game is so huge, exploring it to its full extent inadvertently makes the world less interesting. The tricks, out of necessity, become obvious, the structures and landmarks become formulaic, and the environments start to resemble patches of overstuffed content. By game's end, it's almost like that initial excitement has been punished. And the worst part of this pattern is that the one moment has been taken away. You could go back to the beginning again, but now it would seem unimpressive. It's a very different kind of feeling than re-experiencing a plot beat in a story you've read before. That can retain its power. A fuller context might even enhance it. No, the issue isn't that you know what's out there in that vast world, it's that you know what's there isn't worth the effort. Xenoblade Chronicles X does not completely avoid this pattern, but I found that it's one of the open-world games most resistant to it. This might be because it is not a sandbox. Sandbox games excel in providing the players with a diverse set of interactions. In Tears of the Kingdom, mechanics like Ultra Hand allowed you to manipulate or traverse the environment in an innumerable number of ways, even if the game itself only required you to come up with a few. This was an expansion on previously malleable interactions, like magnesis or being able to climb practically any surface. It was mechanics such as these that ultimately played to the game's core appeal. Xenoblade X, on the other hand, has a very limited set of interactions. It's basically just jumping. See a wall? Try a moon jump. A large gap? Jump, with a running start. A floating chunk of rock in the air? Nope, you're out of luck. There's not much room for maneuverability. Most of the time, if you want to reach a location, you'll have to find the intended path the game has laid out to get there. But that's kind of the hint as to what Xenoblade X does that a lot of sandbox games are more apprehensive about. X creates a structure that must be adhered to. The main story does not ever branch out into multiple objectives. Instead, it is linearly told over the course of 12 chapters that must be completed in one exact order. These story missions are often locked behind prerequisites that must be completed, which in turn often have more prerequisites. The world's geography itself implies a structure. Based on the starting point in NLA, it's pretty easy to intuit that Primordia is the starting area, with Noctilum and Oblivia being fairly equivalent second areas. Caldros is clearly the most dangerous continent to traverse at the outset, and is, not coincidentally, the farthest continent from the starting point. It's not that you can't go there, but not many quests in the beginning will encourage you to do so, and you'll find yourself more limited in terms of where you can access than you would in Primordia. The continents themselves are divided up into strict structure as well. Xenoblade X is generally defined into 3 parts. Solely on foot in chapters 1 through 6, obtaining a Skell in chapters 6 through 9, and obtaining the flight module before chapter 10 and onwards. Each continent has zones which are not meant to be explored until those specific thresholds have been reached, whether that be by placing enemies that would be better taken out on Skell, or by geographical hurdles that can only be overcome by flying directly there. The game effectively builds anticipation to these moments. If you're busy installing probes in Primordia, you'll quickly find that FN Site 110, one of the ones closest to NLA, simply isn't visible. It isn't visible because it's actually on top of this massive ridge that extends all the way to the top of the sky. So now you have to deal with this singular probe-sized gap in your Frontier Nav menu for dozens of hours, until the flight module at last becomes available. These strict structural elements do wonders in preventing Mira from becoming boring too quickly. By limiting where you can go and when you can get there, the game does not have to assume that every single interaction might be encountered at any unspecified time. Even when the game allows you the option to go somewhere before you should, it doesn't necessarily try to make itself accessible. Sure, go to Caldros as soon as you can, but you might just be ambushed by level 30s once you make it past the coastline. In other words, X can build off of its own ideas without worrying if you've been exposed to them yet. Turns out the best open worlds might just be the most linear ones. Linearity is far from the only reason Mira excels. Xenoblade X has its very own open world checklist, but it's contextualized so seamlessly you might not recognize it as such. Being that we need to make a new home for ourselves, one of the major tasks of the game is, naturally, to survey the planet. The survey progress is tracked on the map, where each piece of Mira's geography is tied to a hexagonal segment, which all have some task to be completed. This could be placing down a data probe, hunting a tyrant, acquiring a treasure, or completing a specific quest that takes you to that segment. Segment recon is great. It means there is quite literally no wasted space on Mira. There is a material benefit to visiting every inch of the map. It helps that placing probes down and figuring out how to chain effective ones together is a creative minigame in and of itself. Better yet, accepting tyrant segments, the tasks within each segment facilitate the others. Running out of probes, collection points often drop more of them, as do completing quests. There is no such thing as wasted time or effort in Xenoblade X. Every path you choose to take will result in finding some landmark that might increase revenue for a nearby research probe, or allow you to expand Frontier Nav's network by placing new probes in previously unexplored segments. Even standing still and doing nothing is not a waste of time, as Miranium and revenue are generated passively. It would be wrong to say that exploring X's world is only interesting as a productivity simulator, though. What keeps Segment Recon interesting, despite it boiling down to the same few tasks, is Mira itself. While sci-fi open-world games have become more common since 2015, Mira hasn't lost its edge. Rusted rings jutting out of canyons in Oblivia, abandoned mining drills connected by electrical poles in the ashy skies of Caldros, a rooted pitcher plant hogging the center of the Divine Roost in Noctilum, white algae that hangs off of Sylvalum's giant glowing sphere. All of it evokes the kind of alien world one might expect to see in a pulp magazine from the early 1900s. The animal life is similarly entrancing. From the famous water schlorpers by Primordia's lakes, to the Grexes hunting in packs, or whale-like creatures floating in the skies above, Mira achieves an unlikely verisimilitude. I have no conception of what a planet with life looks like other than Earth, but if one does exist, this seems plausible enough. Mira has only 5 distinct regions. Though this is a much smaller number compared to other Xenoblade games, although not too dissimilar to how 3 is organized, the regions are not as one-note as they appear. They often develop and change as you move through them. Sylvalum, for example, is neatly bisected by a tall cliffside. The south is a pristine lake cut in half by a narrow land bridge, with the aforementioned giant glowing orb situated to the east. The north is a vast desert of white sand, flat mountaintops rising from the east. Noctilum, on the other hand, features 3 distinct segments, a tangled jungle web at the very south, eventually opening up to a waterfall cascade, a field of blue grass, and a third level leading to a sheer cliff up to the Divine Roost. Xenoblade X uses color and lighting in such a striking way. It's not just the environments as they are, the weather effects in this game are unmatched. The light purples of the electromagnetic storms blanketing Oblivia, the redness of the meteor showers over Caldros, or even the characteristic gray and stormy clouds over Primordia that appears all over the promotional material. It's only a shame some of these effects appear too rarely to be fully appreciated, and the sunsets are fantastic. I couldn't not stop and stare. Needless to say, my Switch is full of screenshots. One of the most memorable moments exploring the world is first entering Sylvalum, in case you couldn't tell what my favorite region is yet. Because it's enclosed by rocky teeth on all sides, the only easy entrance is through the beach at the very south. Entering into its maw, 2 ox serfs come flying out, and you're hit with the achievement, Invading Sylvalum. What a great beat to characterize the region as some impenetrable fortress before you even begin exploring it proper. I could continue to list everything breathtaking about Mira, but I think I've gotten the idea down. Playing through the game, Segment Recon becomes almost an added bonus rather than a core mechanic. I'd want to visit the whole map anyways, simply because the architecture is compelling enough on its own. If there were anything to critique Mira's world design, it would probably be the abundance of ganglion strongholds. They get a little stale after a while. There's one place I've yet to mention. While I don't know if I call it beautiful, there is an appeal in the juxtaposition between the alien Mira and the uncannily mundane New Los Angeles. Walking down the pizzerias and boutique stores on Melville Street, or watching people lounge on lawn chairs by the pool in the residential district, you'd be forgiven for thinking it was a completely different game than what awaits past the enormous cover of the Habitat Ring. The juxtaposition becomes even more amusing when you take your Skell cruising down the commercial district like you're a regular part of traffic. What a strange game this is, but that's probably why it built a cult following. We've established the world and its features, along with much of what you'll be doing there, except that is, for the main thrust of the gameplay. Combat has always been an interesting subject in the Xenoblade series. I've had mixed opinions overall. I thought 1's was fun, but then got kinda boring. Had the complete opposite reaction to 2's, but then I thought 3 went back to being kind of boring again. I was curious to see what my thoughts on X's combat were after all this time, given that it's most similar to 1's. And honestly, I don't think I fully grasped X when I first played it in 2015. Now with a better understanding of the combat and Definitive Edition's, well, additions, I think it might be my favorite of the series. One of the most enduring critiques of Xenoblade combat is how much sitting and waiting you do between actions. To be fair to that critique, especially early game, Xenoblades do indeed involve a lot of sitting and waiting. X Definitive Edition though? Very little of that, especially relative to other games in the series. The overdrive mechanic, combined with the new quick cooldown, makes combat unbelievably fast-paced. There's almost always a concrete choice to make, a plan to route in an encounter, or a soul voice to react to. If anything, X's combat feels like it's too easy to break. I didn't make myself any meta builds or much in the way of augments, but I could still confidently shred all but super bosses that stood in my path. Still, I can't say the shredding wasn't engaging. Which leads us to the big item, the main selling point, the one thing everyone seems to admit is pretty neat, the Skells. And yeah, who doesn't want to pilot around a giant mech? As I've previously mentioned, the game waiting so long to give you a Skell is a boon. It encourages you to learn the world and mechanics of the game more meticulously, and effectively builds anticipation by showing you inaccessible or overly dangerous areas that you'll get to visit later. The game is all too happy to rub the weight in your faces, Lynn spending the intro hours gushing over how cool the Skells are. So you can imagine how the excitement builds after dozens of hours of no Skell allowed gameplay, only to be met with one overlong proficiency exam just when it looks in reach. Then at last, you expect catharsis after finally getting your license, but you hop in, take one for a test drive, fight an enemy or two, and realize, oh, Skell combat is not that fun, huh? Consider Zoofarg, the Chapter 10 boss. Chapter 10 is right after the game gives you the flight module, and it's easily the most massive main story boss, in terms of literal size. It's pretty clear that the game wants you to fight this thing in a Skell, using your newly acquired flight module, which is exactly what I began by doing. Only a few minutes in, I realized that strategy wasn't doing much. And I mean this in two senses. I wasn't doing much damage, nor was I participating in the fight all that much. So I promptly exited the Skell and began to wail on Zoofarg the old-fashioned way, on the ground, which proved to be much more effective. Now, my problem here isn't really about effectiveness. I'm fully aware it's possible to outfit my party and I's Skells to kill most things in a few hits. My problem is that the ground combat is just a far more engaging experience overall. With Skells, there is no quick cooldown until post-game, and cooldowns on arts are longer than in ground combat. Not to mention, with most Skells, you're generally working with less arts at any one time since arts are tied to gear. This means far more time is spent doing nothing, save for a lucky cockpit time, which is dictated purely by chance after using an art. Skell Overdrive is also vastly less interesting, as it has no combinations of art types to work through, nor can it be extended by gaining GP. Extensions, like with cockpit time, are up to chance. What we have here is an expressly passive experience. Unlike with ground combat, where the mechanics are directly controlled by the player, Skell combat amounts to pressing a button or two and then wondering whether chance will allow you to engage with the combat further. The result is that even with my Skell in tow, I often opted to fight on foot most of the time, not necessarily because it was the better choice to make, but because it was almost always the more fun choice. And that feels wrong, right? Working so hard to obtain a Skell only to be presented with a watered-down version of the game you've already been playing for 30 to 40 hours is just not an appealing option at all. The alternative is only slightly better. It feels awful to fight the Zoofarg on foot, don't you think? I mean, look at this thing. Does it look like I should be fighting this on foot? Now don't misunderstand me, I am not saying I don't like the Skells. Getting the flight module and soaring across Primordia for the first time is the coolest thing I've ever done in a video game. It was cool in 2015, and it is still cool now. I only wish I could enjoy them more holistically, because before that flight module appears, the Skell is more a burdensome hunk of scrap metal than anything else. And for the marquee feature in the game, that's a bit deflating. On a more positive note, Definitive Edition does get a chance to play around with the Skells some more. I'm not talking about Hraesvelg, though the cruise mode is fun. I'm talking about Volataris. While the original 5 regions on Mira had exclusive places to visit with the flight module, the region was still largely explorable on foot. Volataris, on the other hand, is an area designed with the Skell from the ground up. This leads to some lateral thinking, like having to find unintuitive entrances into islands, such as from the rear or side, to navigate a complex cave system, or similarly showing you a far-off ledge that can only be reached by finding a different entrance to the cave system than the one you entered via foot. Volataris is not the most substantial area ever, and I can imagine it would be significantly more annoying if you're not above Agra level for most of the enemies, but it was nice to get to apply the Skell more critically than the game had required previously. Exploration is this game's strong suit. Xenoblade X has another strong suit, one you've likely heard about just as often as exploring Mira, the side quests. I call them side quests, but that's hardly true. It's closer to the main course than it is the side dish, fulfilling a lot more of the building a new home premise of the game than the main story. Probably why the game actually calls them normal and affinity missions instead. Xenoblade X's structure heavily implies you should be doing these missions often. The prerequisites needed to access the next story mission typically involves completing an affinity mission or two, and surveying a certain percentage of Mira. Those affinity missions also have prerequisites in the form of level gates, certain affinity thresholds with specific party members, or occasionally even normal missions. And we already know one way to increase the survey rate of Mira is by completing normal missions. So by creating prerequisites in this way, Xenoblade X has surreptitiously funneled players into checking out some of the quote-unquote optional looking material. It's easy to see why these missions are held in high esteem. Side quests tend to have a reputation for being trivial, incidental, and forgettable. Xenoblade X tries its best to make its side quests none of these things. It's common for a normal mission to produce tangible changes in the world, whether by introducing new alien species to NLA, a new character or two, or building a water plant out in Primordia, to name the most obvious examples. What makes these changes interesting, though, is that they are not limited to aesthetics. One quest chain will often influence a largely unrelated one. Building the water plant attracts the attention of the Orphean, brought to NLA in a different set of quests, who see the plant as a resource to facilitate their reproduction. This leads into a subplot about sabotage on the plant, which dovetails into a later affinity mission where we collect a bounty on that saboteur. This is a surprisingly complex set of interactions for completely optional content, even before mentioning that some mission objectives and outcomes alter based on the choices you make. Some normal missions are even locked behind said choices. If anything, I would make the argument the game doesn't enmesh the quests together enough. An affinity mission tying into a normal mission is relatively rare, which means the last part of our funnel, story leads to affinity leads to normal, is significantly weaker than the rest. This was apparent on my recent playthrough. During my first experience with X in 2015, I was never able to do every single affinity mission because of the steep affinity requirements needed for every party member. And using every party member on the Wii U version was a hassle, let's say. Definitive Edition has made that particular complaint a non-issue, and made gaining affinity with party members easier, so I made affinity missions my priority this time. But it meant I left an extremely lopsided amount of normal missions for the endgame. Is there a way to strengthen the funnel from affinity to normal? I think so. Definitive Edition may have made it too easy to gain affinity, specifically the number of ways to get affinity easily and not the rate of gain. Every character had 5 hearts stuck to their name before I knew what to do with them. But what if we made it to where gaining affinity was still much easier in Definitive Edition, in that completing normal or other affinity missions gave characters an abnormally large amount of affinity? That way we could strengthen the funnel Xenoblade X already has going for it. If I get a new character and want to raise affinity quickly, then the best option would be by doing 2 or 3 normal missions with them in the party. Why am I so adamant about funneling players into at least a few more normal missions? Well, I think they're worth it for one, and it's nice when systems harmonize with one another. But it's also because of another problem, so to speak, with the affinity missions, one not really a fault of its own. An overwhelming number of our party members are human, and since affinity missions deal with our party members, we end up with a bifurcated quest style where a majority of affinity missions are human problems, and a majority of the normal missions are xenoform problems. Which is itself only an issue because the xenoform problems tend to be vastly more interesting than the human ones. So if you do as few normal missions as possible throughout the game, you'll barely be interacting with any of the alien species. Rather ironic, considering the affinity missions are presented as the premier quests of the game. One of the reasons the xenoform quests are entertaining is that Xenoblade X avoids making its species planets of hats. On the contrary, many quests are deliberately about challenging the preconceived notions and instilled values of that particular species, especially as they make contact with and integrate into human society. Several Manon see them learning to build an eye for aesthetics as opposed to their more practically minded dispositions. The Rothians are your classic warrior race. They view food as raw energy, with little regard to flavor or texture. But upon arriving in NLA, human cuisine has caused one Rothian to become curious about what more food could be if they started accounting for taste. Long story short, the quest concludes with the Rothian deciding to put up the sword and become a chef. In another quest, we meet with an heretical Zerabogan who has defected to provide evidence that their god is a lie. Xenoblade X's alien races aren't breaking any science fiction boundaries here, but they are nuanced enough to remain curious about. On the whole, I conform to the opinion that X has a good selection of side quests, but rather than go through missions willy-nilly to explain why, I want to understand more broadly the architecture of a good quest. Not from a gameplay standpoint, most of it isn't terribly impressive, akin to what you'd see in an MMO defeat and collect, and any mission where you have to wander NLA looking for random intel is just painful, but more so narratively. What makes you want to see the next part of the quest? If I were to hazard a guess, the major constraint in making a satisfying quest is the size. A quest is a discrete narrative unit, generally consisting of 3 or 4 objectives. That's not a lot of time to dedicate to any concept, much less develop it. So it seems to me that the best missions in Xenoblade X will be the ones that understand the economy of the quest, and understand what kinds of concepts can be properly explored given the budgeted time. Straightforward concepts tend to be more successful. One quest, the Party Line, sees an Orphean frustrated with the political canvas in NLA. The different Xeno communities are supposed to choose a representative, but the Manon currently leading the polls seems to be fixated on a nonsensical campaign centered around pizza. That will not represent the Xeno's best interests, Sunbarak figures. So we help sabotage the candidate by slipping drugs into his food right before his now disastrous speech. But then a twist. The next popular candidate, a Nopon, plans to use his political power to prioritize Nopon economic growth at the expense of everyone else. That will not represent the Xeno's best interests, Sunbarak figures. At this point, you have a choice. Let the Nopon run unopposed, or convince Sunbarak to enter the race. If you choose the latter, the quest continues, and you have to convince him that the other alien communities would be willing to vote for an Orphean. Having provided satisfactory evidence, Sunbarak is emboldened and begins his campaign. End mission. Quests like the Party Line demonstrate Xenoblade X's strengths. It's not some stale, grab me 4 bear skins to keep myself warm. There's a story happening here. Sunbarak goes through a mini character arc. Because he thought the Orphean too much a minority for any of the Xeno communities to want them, he felt he had to resort to covert means to make his political objectives realized. But as we show him this is not as true as he thought, Sunbarak realizes that the direct approach might be more effective than initially perceived. It's a quest that ties together multiple alien races we've brought aboard, rooted in a very specific context provided by the game's setting, and it even allows your choices to impact the ultimate conclusion to the quest. It's simple, easy to comprehend, and lightly humorous. The Party Line understands the economy of the quest well. On the other side of the spectrum, quests like Liesel's second affinity mission, Thinking Makes It So, is like trying to fit a Skell into a Nopon cage. I won't even bother with a full summary of the quest, it would take way too long, which is precisely the problem. You're going to try to tell a story about uncovering a secret conspiracy to knowingly ship a faulty prototype while developing Liesel in a relationship with Alicia and exposing the secret mastermind behind said conspiracy who also covered up a murder in how many quest objectives? Like 2 objectives, resulting in the game having to convey all of this information in a 7-minute exposition dump which has no emotional weight because I have known these people for all of about 7 minutes. The quest is so rushed it has to make Kellerman, the villain of the piece, a shouty cartoon character who instantly decides to murder the party the second Alicia spills the beans. There was just no way this story was going to happen given the time allotted. The subject matter exceeds the budget, no matter how talented of a writer you are. Thinking makes it so goes to show that thinking does not, in fact, make it so. Perhaps the woes of this quest could have been alleviated if it had done more work in Liesel's first Affinity mission to get us there. I still think it's too large a story for only 2 quests, but it's a common strategy Xenoblade X uses to get around the limited economy of the quest. It's little surprise that many of the most fondly remembered missions in the game are in fact quest chains. Unlike the party line, which managed to resolve everything internally, leaving a dangling thread here and there or concept unexplored is perfectly fine when you can just pick it up as part of the next quest. Think quest lines like Professor B, a Back to the Future spoof involving a time-traveling Mirren, or Staccata's questline to expose a new religious orthodoxy engineered by the Definians, or the Orphe storyline in which reproduction in NLA causes genetic mutations within the offspring, leading to said offspring being less connected to their ovas. Really, I could be here all day describing the intriguing premises. It might sound obvious to say that, if you're having trouble fitting your story into a single quest, a quest chain will circumvent the economy of the quest. However, it means we now have to concern ourselves with the economy of the quest chain. And it's here where Xenoblade X gets a little more spotty. Let's look at an example where the game gets it right. Hope has 3 affinity missions. Each one clearly builds off of each other. The first mission establishes Hope as a caring, if somewhat diffident character. This is in contrast to Ornella, who pushes Hope to better balance her compassion with practical material needs. The second mission stabs a knife through Hope's back, revealing that Ornella was selling the bodies of her clients to a Definian for spending money. Ornella kills herself when confronted. The third mission has Hope reconciling with the events of the previous quest. She was tricked, and her help inadvertently led to these people's deaths. So is it really responsible for her to continue as if she couldn't be duped again? What's important about these quests isn't so much the actual content, though it is very good, but the fact that they build off of one another in a clear way, arising naturally from the consequences of the previous one. These are not 3 loosely connected events that happen to feature the character. The quests are about Hope, her psychology, in a fundamental way. This is the stumbling block X finds itself in more commonly than Liesel's overstuffing of plot. Many missions simply don't relate to the characters giving us the mission, or the connection is so tenuous it doesn't generate any new insights. This is more so a problem with the Affinity missions. Irina's last Affinity mission, Fathers and Sons, is one extended misconception dealing with mimiosome bodies and age. It would be a pretty good standalone normal mission, but as something that's supposed to relate to Irina, the culmination of her quest chain, it doesn't give me anything conclusive about her except the vaguest concept of family. Gajarg's second Affinity mission, Lionhearted, is simply Gajarg pitting us against one another in a competition to see who can destroy more remaining Rothian Skells still operated by the Ganglion. Again, a fine enough task, maybe a little too close to collecting bear skins, but what is it saying about Gajarg as a character we don't already know? Alexa's 3 Affinity missions all revolve around her flight team, but outside of the second one being mildly entertaining, the 3 missions are more or less random events that don't develop a coherent idea all that well. What we're seeing here is Xenoblade X failing to utilize the economy of the quest chain. Individually, any of these quests are adequate, but when pieced together, they leave something to be desired. When you have multiple missions with repeated characters and developing conflicts, you don't need to rely on simpler issues. You have a much larger canvas to work with. and the previous mission can do some of the work for the next one, as we saw with Hope. In this way, it's sort of the opposite problem we initially had. There is much more up for grabs than these quests desire to take. That leaves us with a few too many okay-ish party members, whose missions you complete and say, that was fine, I guess. I suspect this happens with affinity missions more often than normal missions because there's no prerogative to continue a normal mission quest chain once it's been drained for all it's worth. Some ideas need 2 quests, others need 5, and the structure of normal missions is flexible enough to accommodate. Meanwhile, every party member needs to have 2 or 3 affinity missions, regardless of whether or not there's a good enough idea to carry us across the finish line. I don't want to overstate the issue. No one expects every side quest to be a banger in such a massive game. Xenoblade X's side quests are, on the whole, as good as their reputation purports them to be. It is simply interesting to see a series which usually grapples with such expansive narratives attempt to tackle something exponentially smaller. The lessons learned in X would be used to enhance the side quests in 2 and 3 as well, though for my money, not much can beat the normal missions from X. The xenoform problems, as I've called them, hits at the same pulpy sci-fi aesthetic which makes Mira so distinctive. Oh, and I guess helping Mia for the 5th time is pretty good too. In summation, do the normal missions. We've seen how Xenoblade X uses the main story's mission structure to funnel you into seeing more of Mira and the side quests. Naturally, this chosen structure has implications on how the main story plays out as well. Chapters in Xenoblade X are more episodic. With the exception of Chapter 11 and 12, they lack the clear forward propulsion that characterizes the other Xenoblade games. What I mean is that one chapter's end does not clearly signal what the content of the next chapter will entail. You can intuit that Chapter 5 will take you to Oblivia from a gameplay perspective, considering the previous chapter took place in Noctilum, but there's nothing about Chapter 4 itself that really suggests this as the next logical step in the narrative. For all intents and purposes, you could have set Chapter 5 in Sylvalum if you wanted to. You just have to rewrite the Sandy Bum Canyon scene. A tragedy, I know. And the premise of most of these chapters remains largely the same. There's a piece of the Lifehold out there, go see what's what. I think this explains why Xenoblade X is often criticized for having a story that feels motionless, even empty. The Lifehold investigations always turn up bust, they never lead you any closer to the core, and the next chapter feels like the same thing only in a different location. Chapter 7 in particular feels like a repetition of all the game's basic plot points and concepts without much evolution to the ideas. It more or less follows the same beats as Chapter 4, down to having the same villain. Chapter 10 feels similarly slight, but is buoyed by some good opening scenes and a novel boss fight. Additionally, main story chapters are not that much longer than affinity or normal missions, meaning they're subject to the same economy of quest discussions. By and large, story missions understand this economy well, featuring relatively simple conflicts and clear objectives that can be easily resolved within the scope of a 20 to 30 minute quest. Now, while this was a good thing in normal and affinity missions, the fact that story missions are similarly restricted in scale is a double-edged sword. It frames the main story as a kind of pause between side quest breaks rather than the main event, despite its name. And when you combine that with 1 or 2 disappointing story chapters, as mentioned previously, it can really make the whole thing feel inconsequential. It might mean playing over a dozen or 24 hours of game without any real substantive story advancement. And when you do get something substantive, there's not enough time to simmer and ruminate on it as one would hope. I think these are very understandable critiques of X's main story. Yet despite this, I have to say I enjoyed the main campaign on second go-round a lot more than I anticipated. Mira is positioned in the story as a kind of mediator between races. Elma speculates that her uncanny ability to interpret alien languages without assistance is a consequence of the planet itself. Goetia speaks about a phenomenon space existing around Mira, trapping them within the planet. It's almost as if Mira has a mind of its own, contriving all the players in the story together for a forced confrontation. Mira is the stage upon which the competition between Ganglion and human will be actualized, where they will either learn to understand or annihilate one another. As a result, there aren't really any established power structures to contend with on Mira. Each of the factions we meet along the way is just as confused as the last, trying to make the best of their current situation. The mission structure of the story complements the view of Mira as an incidental meeting ground between peoples. Story missions are impromptu, reacting to the movements and difficulties of Mira's other stragglers. In Chapter 6, we learn about a Ganglion attempt to reclaim a mech lying in Noctilum. The Ganglion are having some difficulties, unable to contend with the tainted wildlife that's made its home there. So we make a plan to gain the upper hand and use our Mim bodies to avoid the creatures and steal the mech from under their nose. A point for the humans in the Great Miran competition. There's a nice formula and style to the missions themselves. As with basically everything with X, there's this fun immersive quality that brings a fairly routine campaign structure to life. I particularly like the mission briefings over the large table at the start of most chapters, filled with diagrams and charts like we're sitting through a work presentation. Xenoblade X's dialogue has a tendency to be cold and technical, concerned with procedure and specifications. It's very insistent on building its own linguistic quirks. We're not scouring continents, fighting creatures, and finding aliens on Mira. We're surveying segments, hunting indigens, and inviting xenoforms, not to mention a whole heaping of ASAPs. By the later chapters, the game has managed to build a comforting cadence. You're there for the morning breakfast and the briefing. Doesn't really matter what the briefing is, it's just another day on the job. The characters are another sticking point with X's story. Chapter 12 tries to make it seem like Gwyn, Irina, Elle, Doug, Lynn, and Elma are the core characters, but it's a bit of a stretch. Since the story beforehand was so lean, there really wasn't a lot of time to delve into the inner turmoils and preoccupations of the cast. This leads to a lot of serviceable personalities, but nothing terribly stand out. Elle feels like he's here for the Lifehold infiltration for no other reason than him being arbitrarily assigned the role of main story character, whether or not he actually holds such significance. Many of the villains in the story are underserved too. The Ganglion gets a rogues gallery of sorts, only I'm fairly certain this shot is the only reason Goetia is even remembered as a character. And the most interesting thing about Dagon and Reese is how little screen time they get. Yes, even when the game does give more attention to a character, things can still get awkward. Shosan is X's most confusing character. During his introduction, the game poisons the well by having Gwyn state, "From political aide to director general in just a few weeks. At this rate, he'll be emperor by next month." Followed by Irina accusing Shosan of never letting the truth get in the way of a good speech, when he embellishes how many new recruits Elma retrieved from the Starfall Basin. The implication is that Shosan will be some power-drunken tyrant. This begins Xenoblade X's very strange game of smoke and mirrors with itself. I cannot overemphasize how frequently the game throws Shosan under the bus with some absolutely wild accusations, either for no reason or to immediately walk them back. In the Spy Games Affinity mission, Shosan asks us to accept a mission both our immediate bosses, Vanda and Nagi, refuse to authorize for being too dangerous. The mission is to infiltrate a Ganglion stronghold so that they have more intel to work off of for a later planned strike. Shosan claims this intel could offer leverage in bargaining for an accord and has the potential to save far more lives in the long run. Sounds admirable. Then Elma hits Shosan with the,
"Are those really your only reasons for wanting this intel?"
After successfully retrieving data from the base, Shosan hopes for continued cooperation between him and our team, causing Elma to reiterate her suspicion.
"Of course, as long as our goals align."
This conversation is followed by an absolutely bizarro scene, where Lin implies that Shosan intentionally left his son to die on Earth by sending him on a mission right before the white whale lifted off, to which Elma responds with a full-throated defense of his character. I truly do not know what to make of this whole mission. At no point thus far has Shosan done or even implied having done something unscrupulous. Even if the mission was dangerous, he seemed to have genuine beliefs that this would benefit our cause. But we must be building up to something crazy, right? The spurious accusations continue. In Prospective Partners, after Shosan learns that the Rothians have left on hostile terms with the Ganglion, he proposes we prepare for the possibility of an alliance. The first step is to gather data from the latest Rothian-Ganglion battle site. After discovering a Rothian Skell, Shosan requests we bring it back for analysis. This prompts Elma to speculate about Shosan's intentions, claiming that his interest in gathering intel about Rothian Skells is so that NLA can better prepare for offensive measures, should an alliance with the Rothians fall through. I'm not so sure why we were supposed to find any of this behavior suspicious. This seems like a perfectly reasonable precaution. Elma even offers an entire rationale as to why Shosan's perspective is sound, especially given his position as the representative of NLA. At all points in this quest, Shosan indicates that he hopes peace is on the table. It seems perfectly genuine to me, but it definitely didn't stop the game from blasting sinister music in the background. The game can't even frame him as an obstinate bureaucrat correctly. In Celica's affinity mission, New in New LA, Shosan attempts to find a use for Rock. He argues that allowing Rock and Celica into NLA is a liability, given that they are wanted by the Ganglion, and that NLA cannot afford spare housing and food to someone like Rock without him offering material assistance in return. Elma jumps in immediately to set the tone on how we should view this conversation. Are you making deals here or threats? And the answer is, he's making a deal. While Rock is morally against fighting as a pacifist, Shosan eventually concedes that he can offer assistance in a non-combatant role, allowing him to become a full citizen of NLA. The gang responds by apologizing for thinking Shosan was so unreasonable, clearing up a point I'm pretty sure only the game was confused about. You could criticize Shosan for being a little too hot-headed in the beginning, but given the circumstances of humanity's situation on Mira, thinking Rock should contribute if he wants to stay is not beyond the pale. In fact, as an added dimension of reasonability, this final scene even begins with Shosan saying,
"It's premature to say there is no chance of peace with the Ganglion. We can't assume needless risk."
I'm sorry to disappoint Xenoblade X, but I think Shosan might not be the person you think he is. The amusing part of all this is that Shosan ends up being one of the most respectable and reasonable characters in the game. He holds a balance between pragmatism and optimism, and demonstrates a consistent strategy of opting for non-violence whenever possible, whilst ensuring actionable safeguards are in place where necessary. He seems like a reasonable leader for NLA that places his duty before personal gain, and is someone that's willing to accommodate for the lifestyles and bespoke issues of the xenoform communities. If anything, it's actually nice that he isn't the obviously slimy politician the game seems dead set on painting him as. Emperor Shosan, remember, that's how this game introduced him. So far, we've seen that Xenoblade X has plenty of underwritten characters, and other characters that somehow feel confused and satisfying at the same time. Not exactly the rosiest of pictures. So let's lift the mood by talking about one of the game's unmitigated successes. Grand Counselor Luxar is one of the best Xenoblade villains around. I am not joking, this guy is hilarious. Here is a character utterly convinced of his importance. He will lead his followers on a messianic quest to save his great people and bring them into a new age of enlightenment under their reborn-again god. Luxar demands respect from others because he knows he cannot command any himself. In one great scene, Luxar attempts to goad Gajarg by reminding him of his former position as prince, now reduced to one of the Ganglion's lowly henchmen. But Luxar is hopelessly outmatched. Gajarg is a man who rank means little to. His subservience is a constant source of disgust for him, continued only out of necessity and no belief. He is spurred by Elma's denouncement of their compliance as weakness and cowardice. Elma should be believed in this accusation not because she represents a higher authority, but because she speaks truth to power. Here is someone people would choose to follow regardless of position. And so, unfazed by such provocations, Gajarg crushes Luxar with a single counselor.
It's Grand Master, damn you!
Making very clear who does and does not care about titles around here. At base, Luxar's pathetic attempt at repartee was mere projection. He thought Gajarg would be bothered by the removal of his princely status, only because that would bother him to his core. Because power is not about dignity or honor, it is only a title. Xenoblade X makes abundantly clear how unimpressive it finds Grand Counselor Luxar. Nearly every single scene with this guy is him being subverted, undermined, or insulted.
Master Luxar!
I thought I told you never to disturb me in this chamber. What is it? Gajarg, you traitor! I should have known those ungrateful rats would bite the hand that feeds them!
Grandmaster, sir!
I heard you the first time, imbecile! Lower your voice in my presence.
It's the recently completed Zufar, sir. Reese made off with it.
What did you say? Why would she do that? Why does everyone in this confounded organization think they can do whatever they please?
Sir, we can no longer effectively strike the target.
Where are the interceptors?
An enemy detachment has cut them off. They can't reach us.
But these are savages, not... No, I refuse to believe it. You traitorous scum. What happened to our bargain? Do you humans have no principles at all?
Principles? You deal with a traitor, you really shouldn't be surprised when you get stabbed in the back!
Even the camera seems to have his way with him, framing him as a tiny figure in his grand chamber, or his video chat companions as much larger, dominating figures. During the final battle, the Ganglion begin to get pummeled. Luxar justifies his use of the Vita, ostensibly made only for their god.
The Great One's blood runs in these veins. I will use it, because I must use it.
The self-importance can't be overstated. In reality, the Ganglion are an insignificant little blip in the politics of the cosmos, a run-of-the-mill crime syndicate with no special standing, led by Luxar, an overgrown booger desperately groveling for the assistance of a god who does not care and will not answer. Luxar may fashion himself the Ganglion's hero, but in the end, he's just another one of the players in Mira's little game. Of all the characters though, if there were any to be singled out as being the best, it would likely be a contest between Elma, Lin, or Lao. Not surprising since they get the most screen time out of anyone else, but these characters, along with Luxar, form the backbone of X's story in a way most of the other characters don't. This is because each of these figures plays a central role in X's single biggest neurosis, the Mimiosomes. Xenoblade X is obsessed with the Mims. From the moment the concept is introduced, so many of the story's conversations become explicitly or implicitly about the Mims. Do the things presiding inside these synthetic bodies really represent humanity? Or are we just walking skells of our former self, sleek robot exteriors only pantomiming human beings? To that end, the game places our key characters across an ideological map. Elma is the game's most staunchly pro-Mimiosome character. To Elma, biology is simply a matter of practical function. In Chapter 10, Lin considers the possibility that Blade's efforts to plant probes across Mira will be rendered pointless if they can't find the Lifehold core before the countdown's end. Their MIMs will simply cease functioning, and their consciousnesses will be lost forever. The thought terrifies Lin enough to start crying. Elma consoles her, prompting Lin an ingress into X's central curiosity. These Mims, why would you want to make an artificial body that can cry tears? Elma responds with a very factual analysis.
Well, lots of reasons. Tears lubricate the eyes. They flush out dust and debris. And unwanted feelings, too. You feel better, don't you?
In Elma's mind, the body is simply a means to an end. Humans are not special because they can cry. Those tears are only there to serve an important evolutionary function. If that function can be mimicked by something equivalent, then the job is complete. Lin essentially verbalizes the idea at the Mim's introduction. Mimiosomes are designed to mimic human physiology as much as possible. The whole point is for us to forget about them. It seems for the people living in NLA, the fact of Mimiosomes is almost a non-factor. The functions of the human body were replicated, and the consciousnesses stuck inside those replications could barely tell the difference between the real thing. On the other side of the spectrum is Luxar, who fetishizes the human body. To the Ganglion, human bodies are uniquely dangerous and threatening. Mimiosomes are hollow puppets. Humans are not special because of their consciousness. What makes a human is the specific genetic sequence written out in their DNA. That is what must be destroyed to stop humanity. Given the positions as I've defined them, it may seem the argument Xenoblade X will warm to on the Mims is obvious. Clearly Elma is correct, and humanity exists beyond their flesh, defined by the fragile illusion that is the continuity of consciousness, as she puts it in Chapter 12. This is, as we'll see, ultimately the case, but it's not as clear-cut as it may first appear. Xenoblade Chronicles as a series is, in truth, much more wary about this transhumanist stuff than it lets on. Let us not forget, there is a reason why mankind moves one step closer to the divine is the original sin of the series. Xenoblade does not think toying around with human aptitude is likely to produce anything good for us. Convergence of man and machine has always been at the forefront of Xenoblade Chronicles, but the series' central concern is that our project to establish a new human form will lead to the creation of a second-class people, a slave race. Importantly, it is almost always the newly created beings who become oppressed. In Xenoblade 2, this conflict was represented via the relation between blades and drivers, an explicitly hierarchical dynamic. While Indal facilitated an effective slave trade throughout Alrest, there was the implication that this became possible only because the architect designed blades to be subservient to their drivers at a genetic level, in one sense recreating his initial mistake onto yet another world. Xenoblade 3 took a more hardline stance against transhumanism. Recall that the game's objection to Ionios was not that it was immoral, but that it was degenerate. Or more accurately, Ionios was only immoral because it was unnatural. The annihilation events were resultant from the worlds combining in a way disallowed by the physics of the universe, explaining why so many of the characters repeated the somewhat vexing phrase that the world needed to be brought back to the way it was meant to be. Part of how the game represented Ionios' unnaturalness was by juxtaposing the people of the city, who were able to reproduce and create legitimate descendants, with those trapped in Mobius's cycle, whose unorthodox methods of rebirth and recycling through origin were weaponized to enslave them into an endless war. This juxtaposition ultimately led Xenoblade 3 into the crosshairs of a confounding contradiction, wherein it simultaneously venerated the city for exercising free will and upholding the natural order of proper human conception, but then denied the city a choice when their autonomy became inconvenient for the unambiguously happy ending the game wanted to provide for its main characters. These examples do present us with a small wrinkle, in that the transferring of consciousness, be it through the lifehold or within origin, is deemed a necessary evil for survival. All of the games in the series seem to agree with the continuity of consciousness argument, and that transferring the mind into a machine will not destroy the person. Yet at the same time, the series can't quite commit itself fully to this point of view. Xenoblade has also made clear that these technological states ought to remain temporary, ensuring that the biological state of being is eventually restored. Xenoblade 2 revealed a similar kind of wrinkle, with the blades eventually giving life to biological life over generations. And it's pretty blatant that Xenoblade 3's desired end state for the peoples of Ionios is a world where everyone is able to have lots of sex and big beautiful babies that wrap their hands around your finger. There is, I think, something telling in the fact that Fiora has been rid of her Mechon-esque appearance by the credits of Xenoblade 1. Xenoblade X manifests the same conflict structure with the ganglion. Why do they fear the DNA of the human body? It is because the Sumerians created them as artificial lifeforms to do their bidding, and wrote inside the ganglion a failsafe that could be activated by any of Samar's descendants' DNA, in turn forbidding them from turning against their masters. The ganglion feared that the humans, being one of these descendants, would return to enslave them or destroy them for their disobedience. Either way, once again, we see the machine enslaved by its own programming. But now we get to the interesting question. As we've seen from how Luxar is presented throughout the game, we're obviously supposed to view his certainty that true humanity emerges from their DNA with extreme skepticism, to put it lightly. But even if it rejects this essentialist view, does X, like its siblings, also think the biological state of affairs is preferable to the mechanical one? Well, it's complicated. Xenoblade X might be the most ambivalent game in this regard. The thing is, there's one extremely negative perspective on the Mimizones we've yet to explore. Luxar's fear that humanity may rise up to become an enslaver is a concern more subtly shared with Lao, who forms a temporary alliance with the Ganglion over their shared rejection of humanity. In The Matchmaker, Lao states he never really saw the point in Mim relationships. In Chapter 9, Lao justifies himself leading Elma and company into a trap because he believes dying as a Mim isn't meaningful, as they'll just be reborn into a new body once the core is recovered. He hints as to the reason this bothers him earlier in the scene.
Look at us, the chosen few. All those people we left on Earth, they never had a chance. But us, we can be reborn. We get as many damn chances as we want.
Unlike Luxar, Lao's rejection of the Mims as true humanity has little to do with genetics. There's a sense Lao understands true humanity as a moral term, one that he believes the Mimiosomes fly in the face of. Lao finds the Mims repulsive because it implies humanity is replaceable and transferable. He rejects Elma's assertion that she never understood why humans separate themselves off by race, by class, religion, country, age, as if it matters in the end. On a functional level, humans are all virtually identical. Therefore, according to Elma, they should be easily unified in purpose as well. But Lao thinks Elma fails to appreciate the value each unique human being brings to the table. Just because they look the same or are built the same does not mean one can be replaced with another. Indeed, the managers of Project Exodus knew very well that people are not replaceable in this way. 20 million consciousnesses could fit within the Lifehold, but it wouldn't do to grab any 20 million consciousnesses. It needed to be 20 million of the right ones. Consciousnesses that were close friends, colleagues, partners, family, ones that would be most likely to ferry humanity to a new world. If only a fraction of humanity could be saved, it had to be people they wanted to have a new life. In a way, Project Exodus inadvertently confirms Luxar's original suspicion. Given the opportunity, humanity will divide between those who are more worthy and those who are less worthy, and not just about who gets to leave Earth. Lao implies that there is such a division going on in the White Whale too. The only reason people like you and me get on board the White Whale is because they could use our skills, exploit our talents. Lao and Lin aren't important for their humanity, they're laborers. And in the recesses of the Mimiozone Maintenance Center, humanity works on a new project, one where people only imagine they have will, but in fact are completely artificial consciousnesses, unknowing slaves to their human masters. In the J-bodies, the ganglion sees their past and future. For Lao, it is the escape from death that is most offensive about the Mims, the one grace the people left behind on Earth were denied. Through the transfer process, the Mimiosomes allow the corrupt waiting inside the Lifehold core complete immunity from accountability, giving them as many damn chances as they want. No matter how many times they fail or make a mistake or wear out their bodies, the transferring of consciousnesses will mean they get another life to waste. Pain, too, is simply optional. It can be stopped with a few simple inputs from a datapad, preventing the user from experiencing any long-lasting consequences for their actions. Thus, the only way to give these people the accountability they deserve is to destroy the core and ensure transfers are impossible from the outset. This, he claims, will stop those bastards from purging what made us human. Because what made us human was not our consciousnesses or our genetics, but the decisions we made to get here. In making the choice to hold humanity accountable, Lao believes he will be letting the species die with an ounce of dignity, the dignity that makes humans human. It's an argument the game is at least sympathetic to, causing even the player avatar to turn against Elma for the first and only time in the game. However, X can't bring itself to agree with Lao's prescriptions. There are small moments throughout the story hinting that Lao has begun to see Lin as a surrogate daughter. In one scene, Lao asks how someone so young managed to secure a spot on the White Whale. After learning her parents helped design the engine on the White Whale, Lao assumes Lin got a spot as thanks to your parents for all their hard work. Elma corrects the record, insisting that Lin earned a spot all on her own. Elma suggests Lin was not given a chance because of nepotism, but genuine skill. This shift is important because it is people like Lin that causes the game to reject Lao's proposal. To destroy the core at this stage wouldn't only mean the destruction of those who selfishly selected the future of the human race. It would also entail the destruction of those exploited believers, the people who put in the hard work for their world with no ulterior motives. Lao hates what humanity chose to become in order to execute Project Exodus, but he does not hate Lin. So he ultimately chooses to place his faith in her, that people like her may become the better stewards of the future. Lao expounds on his newfound faith in the final chapter.
These Mimiosomes, they aren't just ghosts or shadows. They're people, seeds of new life that are struggling to take root.
That almost sounds like a ringing endorsement of the Mims. Will Xenoblade X do what no other Xenoblade has before, and have humanity remain fully integrated within the machine? Well, we don't really know. The cliffhanger at the end of Chapter 12 could be read either way. With the Lifehold core being destroyed from the very beginning, future adventures could have them trying to find the actual storage of their consciousnesses, and finally restore their original bodies. On the other hand, humanity may have to learn to remain and propagate solely as mimeosomes. Personally, I would prefer the latter, but judging based on this series' history, my bet would be on the former. Move aside continuity of consciousness, fleshy hands and bones are clearly true humanity. Xenoblade X is undoubtedly the simplest of the Xenoblade stories. Lao, the Mims, and the plot to steal the Vita are about the only thing going on in the main story past Chapter 6. Given how long each story mission is, there would not be much room for anything more, which is likely the biggest critique one could make of X's story as is. The game could make more room for itself if it didn't feel the need to keep its cards so close to its chest, where everything becomes a secret plot twist. You know, Elma, if you wanted to keep the Lifehold running out of power a secret, maybe putting a conspicuous countdown on a giant display visible from anywhere in the city is the literal worst possible way to do that. No way that'll cause a panic. The mimeosomes are, funnily enough, the best example of this tendency. There really is no reason why they keep this fact of our existence quiet until the end of Chapter 5. I get that it's a way to harmonize the story with the gameplay, as Overdrive is tied to us being Mims, but what was preventing us from realizing we could do this beforehand? If anything, revealing the Mims earlier would give the story more room to talk about them. You'll notice that both the Lao plot and the Luxar plot, really the game's biggest and best pieces of story, don't begin until Chapter 6, because they rely on us knowing about the Mims. This would be easy to contrive too. You could move the arm-ripping scene to Chapter 2 when we fight the dangerous tyrant, although the last thing the first 3 chapters need is more exposition. Things like Lao's motivation, which plays well with the overall narrative, doesn't quite carry the punch it should because the details are so sparse. We don't really understand the particular of how or who was involved with the Exodus plan. This could have been expanded on had it come up before the second to last chapter. Even the big moments in Chapter 12 struggle a little under scrutiny. Does it make sense that the mechanics of the Lifehold are a secret to everyone but the top brass? How would you even keep that a secret in the first place? And does keeping it a secret really make the story better? Much of X's secretiveness feels like secretiveness for the sake of it. Alternatively, these elements could have been fleshed out by placing more material about them in side quests, which is generally what X does. But strangely, most story-related content simply never appears in side missions that aren't explicit prerequisites for the next story chapter, even if those elements will never appear in the main story again. So yes, there's a lot of clumsy and half-baked stuff here, but I would overall say X's reputation in terms of story is more sour than it deserves. It's not 12 chapters of pointless side questing with a slightly grandiose presentation. Once it finally gets the elements into play, the narrative retains a clear focus that often gets overlooked. Xenoblade X, for all its dissimilarities, confronts the key anxieties underpinning the series in a direct and digestible way. Then they added more. I wouldn't say I completely hated Chapter 13. I wouldn't say I liked it either. It's definitely a more sophisticated work than the base game, effortlessly weaving multiple different plot lines and characters to support a coherent thematic argument in such a confined space. But some of the choices it makes are so exhausting. I suppose we should begin with the Millosaur in the room, Mira. At this point, I think I have to accept Xenoblade and I will never see eye to eye on this kind of thing. I just do not understand this series' penchant for ending their games by destroying everything in sight. It's true that all Xenoblade games have ended with some kind of radical transformation of the world, signifying the dawn of a new era of harmony, with reconfigured geopolitical and cultural relationships. These transformations are a metaphorical gesture that societal progress requires great shifts in thinking and being. But then we get to 3 and X, and when your writerly invocation of societal progress involves the disappearing of peoples, or, in X's case, the culling of multiple universes worth of life, the metaphor has officially been stretched beyond its usefulness. But that implies the metaphor was even useful to begin with. Xenoblade 3 and X's endings better occupy the domain of negation rather than transformation. This is an important distinction. There was the understanding that even though the worlds had changed in 1 and 2, the relationships formed between characters and the time you put in to help them remained contiguous. These were not new people starting afresh. Not so in 3 and X. When we look at, say, Xeon's Ascension quest, what do we find? We find a leader and colony desiring to live in a self-sustaining way, willing to form mutual bonds and contracts with other colonies to make that happen. It is quests like these that show the slow, tedious work that will forge the first steps towards a new world. Yet these actions are negated by the ending. Xeon will forget how to farm, and the partnership between Colony 9 and Tau will be dissolved. No matter what Xeon's future ends up looking like, it is doubtful he will need to be self-sufficient in the manner this quest taught him how to be. A timeline where Noah and party help Xeon versus one where they do not will result in functionally no difference for Xeon and his colony. Consider Xenoblade X's main draw, charting Mira by expanding Frontier Nav. By doing so, we were able to collect mass quantities of data on the geography, wildlife, and climate of the planet, all in an effort to better our chance of building a future for humanity. Yet X's ending negates this progress. On one hand, this negation is not as complete as 3's. The general techniques developed by surveying Mira will likely come in handy on other worlds, and the relations between characters will carry over, but the specifics are still lost. We no longer need to build a better life on this planet, learning to coexist within its unique ecosystems and environments. The key point I'm making is that the main thrust of 3 and X's side content, which both games heavily push you to engage with, already demonstrates the kind of radical transformations implied by their endings. Thus, the narrative utility of these last-minute negations becomes redundant at best or counterproductive at worst. It is simply unnecessary to destroy the world to prove a point the last 90 hours of the video game had already proven 10 times more effectively. I'm trying to steer us away from the idea that destroying Mira was a narrative inevitability. It would be astonishingly easy to tell the same exact story as Chapter 13 without Mira's destruction. Or Xenoblade X could have simply chosen to do something else. It doesn't follow that because every previous Xenoblade game has chosen to reconfigure their worlds, a proper ending for Xenoblade X must choose to do the same. If anything, it seems likely the original game was not choosing to do this, at least not anytime soon. The quest with the highest recommended level is Then and Now, unlocked after beating Chapter 12. It effectively acted as an epilogue to the base game back in 2015, Xenoblade X's final word, as it were. The quest ends with the group resolving to make a prosperous future for humanity on Mira. The text after beating the quest reads, "The fight to forge a new home on Mira has just begun." That's a pretty silly final sentence to end off on for a game that supposedly has every intention of blowing up the place the next chance it gets. There are so many oddities like this between the base game and the new content. The Ganglion, for example. The backstory of the Ganglion given by Chapter 13 technically lines up with the explanation that the Samarians created new life forms to serve them, in the sense that it was one Samarian for one very specific purpose, but that is some serious torturing of that line's implications. Furthermore, I don't know how to reconcile Luxar and Void's motivations. They just seem entirely unrelated to one another. And sure, Lyn does end the base game envisioning a future where humanity leaves the planet, but I figured that was more of a generational aspiration than a next week kind of thing. There are more subtle changes. We can see them from how it treats the player character. One of Xenoblade X's most unique choices relative to the rest of the series was the inclusion of a player-made avatar instead of a dedicated protagonist. Accordingly, the avatar played much less significance in the unfolding of the plot. This was implied by the structure of the story, where our next goals were not dictated by our desires as a character, but as routine jobs the bosses on high wanted us to do. Our character is de-emphasized in micro ways as well. The inclusion of features like squadrons emphasized our role as one of many within Blade, doing their job to secure a foothold in Mira. Despite doing all the work, we are not even a leader, just the Rook and Elma's team. While missions like Then and Now did imply the actions of Team Elma had begun to build them a reputation, we were still in the end playing our part within Blade. These choices made sense in a game whose general premise was as broad as rebuilding humanity. Chapter 13 chafes with this choice. Al defies the character conventions typical of Xenoblade X, branding him a hero whom the rest of the cast are all too quick to hype up. Al spends his affinity missions grooming you to become his successor, culminating in a final showdown at the end of Act 3 where you alone solo hordes of ghosts in a scene which parallels Al's actions from the beginning of the game. Chapter 13 wants you to know that, like Al, you aren't some Joe Schmo or Elma's subordinate, you're the hero's protege. It's far from the only way Chapter 13 indicates a pivot in intentions. We saw before that X was pretty singularly focused on how the White Whale's journey to Mira implicated the soul of humanity. Did sticking people in robot bodies change humanity? Or did the ethics of Project Exodus do most of the changing beforehand? And what would the future of humanity look like after the ganglion? Chapter 13 is significantly less interested in such things. Act 1 makes that known. As soon as the DMAT events appear, the Blade senior staff deliberate. The Lifehold core investigation pales in comparison to this. Congruently, the investigation of the core is later settled with a few tidy lines of exposition, explaining that humanity's consciousness is being stored by some larger universal mechanism, leaving the topic in essentially the same limbo Chapter 12 left us in. And when Chapter 13 speaks of souls, it is to construct a new framing for them, divorced from genetic or continuity of consciousness arguments. But I'll put a pin in this point for now. It's no surprise that Chapter 13 should find little interest in Lao, a character whose central role was to facilitate a debate about the MIMS. The game quickly scuttles him away after resolving the cliffhanger at the end of the base game, but not before repurposing him for Chapter 13's new thematic interest. Lao restates his reason for helping the ganglion, saying that he did so because he had given up. It wasn't about grief or retribution, plain despair tipped me over the edge. This is despite the fact that Lao directly states his plan became about revenge during Chapter 11, a motive which matched his belief that the makers of Project Exodus would never be held to account otherwise. But I guess retribution and revenge aren't exactly the same word. I'm more sympathetic to this change, given that it may have been influenced by the passing of Lao's Japanese voice actor. That being said, the specifics of Lao's change in motivation are very telling to the epilogue's goals. Chapter 13 is first and foremost concerned with life and death. The game wants to compel us to live in the face of despair and understand what propels a person to want to live in the first place. This is why Al directly wonders if Lao's hopelessness is what caused him to accept death, and why Lao departs with the wish that Lin choose to live in his stead. But the game actually gives us a more specific answer much earlier than this scene. During Act 1, Lin recounts her time with Al aboard the White Whale. Here we see Xenoblade X state exactly what it thinks motivates people to live.
Al always said that people need a place to belong. Not like a location, or some specific address or whatever. It's more somewhere you'd keep coming back to. Somewhere people liked and trusted you.
She clarifies further, speaking about how Al's home swapped initially from his sister and family on Earth to the crew of the White Whale after Earth's destruction, now calling Lin her family. This last piece of information links together the conversations. Xenoblade X argues that our will to live is motivated by a place where we belong, and that this belonging, the thing that motivates us to keep coming back, arises from a longing to be with our family. Thus, we see how Chapter 13's reinterpretation of Lao easily fits the thematic logic. The loss of his family destroyed his sense of belonging, and along with it, his motivation to live. Lao then gave in to despair, causing him to accept death. Though I've made clear I think Chapter 13 is a pivot, I also want to make clear that Chapter 13 is not a totally unreasonable pivot either. It's not such a stretch that a game about humanity's survival might end up in a spot where these topics would arise. And as we saw with Lao, the game does a pretty clever job refactoring the character to fit its new argument. Even though it was mostly in relation to Project Exodus and the MIMS, Lao was a character fascinated with death and family in the base game, and there was indeed the implication in Chapter 11 that Lao wanted to kill himself so he could see his daughters again. I always want to try to see a story where it's at, so while I'm personally frustrated that it was very much not something about this planet, and I'm directionally opposed to things like the destruction of Mira, we should at least try to take the epilogue on its own terms and see what it's trying to say. Maybe it will convince me. Act 2 is where I start to get more annoyed. One of my central critiques of the ending of Xenoblade 3 was that it didn't adequately address the moral implications of destroying Ionios, particularly with respect to the people of the city. I thought it was an internal inconsistency with the narrative, given that Xenoblade 3 was very concerned with giving people the freedom of choice. Xenoblade X, on the other hand, attempts to remedy this critique by dedicating all of Act 2 to focusing on the conflicts that would arise from the destruction and humanity's subsequent abandonment of Mira. I should be very happy about this, right? Well, I would be if Act 2 weren't so painfully shallow in its approach to the subject. We've already seen that Chapter 13 has a concrete argument for why people choose to live. But when faced with self-made challenges to its own thesis, we'll see the substance of its argument is seriously lacking, causing the game to resort to some shifty tactics to avoid answering the difficult questions it accidentally wanders itself into. Act 2 is more or less a world tour guilt trip, squashing any ambivalence one might have about Mira's destruction by letting you know you're straight up wrong to disagree with the game's decision. Take Omomo. A friend of hers from NLA asks us to pick her up from Sylvalum, but when we ask her to leave, Omomo refuses. Her husband is buried here, and she figures she'd rather wait for the end beside her husband than abandon him to the DMAT events. I'm sure you'll agree this is a devious dilemma. In a story that desperately wants to tell us to choose to live, here is someone who is definitely not making that choice. How will the game respond to this? Well, the answer is the game is not even going to try. Almost immediately after Omomo finishes her explanation, Elma butts in. Are you sure that's the only reason? There's something else, isn't there? Lynn adds. They are correct in their suspicion. It turns out the real reason Omomo wants to stay behind is because if she goes aboard the White Whale, she will be a burden on everyone due to her old age. What are you doing, game? This is a completely different issue. What's important to understand about this slippery substitution of motives is that the second motive is far easier to contend with than the first. The first deals with personal values and beliefs, about honoring the memory of our loved one, their significance to us, perhaps even intersecting with perspectives on the afterlife. Omomo's first motivation tells us what she values about her life. That a life that isn't next to her husband, even if her husband is just a pole stuck in some dirt, wouldn't be worth living. The second motive is a cognitive distortion. It relies on Omomo falsely believing that she would be a burden, jumping to the conclusion that her family would definitely feel this way, and exaggerating the amount she's already burdened her family thus far. Cognitive distortions are by definition irrational, and therefore the game can effortlessly frame Omomo's eventual decision to join the White Whale as unambiguous, the vanquishing of that nasty distortion. What was that about her husband again? Shh, don't think about that. After our conversation with her, we leave thinking Omomo is going to stay on Mira. Lynn asks if our giving up on convincing her was the right answer, to which Elma responds,
I don't think there was one. One thing's certain. We must move forward, whatever the outcome. And that's it.
That certainly sounds like the game acknowledging that Omomo's perspective has validity, so we should give the game some credit, right? No, you definitely shouldn't. If there's one thing you take away from my discussion on Chapter 13, know that the game is not being honest when Elma says she isn't sure there's a right answer. Xenoblade X absolutely believes there's a right answer, in the strongest of terms, and Omomo would be doing something terribly wrong if she chose to stay. How can we be so sure of this? Because of the Lynn subplot that runs through Chapter 13, particularly in Act 2. The same scene where Lynn explains Al's argument on the will to live doubles as the setup to a minor conflict. After Lao's death, Lynn feels she can't trust Al's argument. She's uncertain about her own will. Should she choose to live? Why? What for? Act 2 gives us a resolution to this subplot. Lynn says to Al,
The spirit isn't something one human body can contain. And it's not part of the consciousness packaged inside a mimeosome either. Other people can reflect someone's way of thinking, even their way of being. Which means that a person's spirit can exist in every other person whose life they touch. That's how I see it now.
No such thing as a soul that exists in isolation, huh?
Al summarizes. Lin answers that she will choose to live to preserve the part of Lao's spirit that still resides within her. Understanding this scene is the cipher to decrypting Chapter 13. It's fitting that Lin and Al's conversation should appear immediately following Omomo's decision to return to NLA, because it articulates a precise argument for why Omomo staying on Mira would be disastrous. Because the essence of an individual does not reside in isolation, but amongst the many others that individual touches, choosing not to live represents more than the death of that singular individual. Lin recognizes this and understands that if she had chosen not to live, not only would her life be extinguished, she would also be killing the part of Lao residing within her. It worked in reverse after all. Lao decided to give up, and in doing so, killed the part of Lin that had imprinted onto him. The result is that Lao ended up infecting Lin with his own despair, kickstarting her doubts about Al's thesis and this entire subplot. By the same token, if Omomo had chosen to stay on Mira, she would be killing pieces of every single one of her friends and family members that went aboard the White Whale, the part of their souls that had reflected onto her over the course of her life. This explains why Lin's reaction to hearing Omomo's reason for staying behind is,
You can't just give up on living like this. If you stay alive, you can support your family. That's the real way to happiness.
Xenoblade X believes family, the place where we belong, manifests our will to live, and were Omomo to help destroy her family in any way, she would also be destroying their will to live. It's hard to imagine coming up with a stronger condemnation of Omomo's thinking than this, and yet I have this nagging feeling. What if Omomo didn't have another secret reason? What if her only reason was that she genuinely wanted to die next to her husband? Would the game be as eager to deliver Lin's logic? To tell Omomo that her desire to be with her husband was selfish and harmful? If yes, why didn't they? What was the need to invent this brand new, easily defeatable position? Perhaps a second example may give us some clarity on the game's thoughts. Happily, Xenoblade X provides. Enter Ted, a curator who isn't completely on board with the second Project Exodus. Ted feels that we bear some responsibility to the flora, fauna, and animals on Mira that we're not taking with us. He feels that we bear some responsibility for the fate these creatures will now be subjected to, and, logical or not, wants to go down with them. Tatsu then suggests we collect samples of genetic data from each region so that once we land on a new planet, at least some of the life on Mira can be restored elsewhere. Ted agrees. Did you notice? The game just did it again. Like with Omomo, wherein a complex belief was sneakily substituted for a simpler cognitive distortion, Xenoblade X doesn't actually want to engage with the morality of the situation. Instead, Ted's problem can be alleviated with some menial legwork. Ted simply lacked, or failed to think about, all relevant data when making his decision. This subplot began by asking us to consider whether or not we have a responsibility to the indigenous life on Mira. But collecting a bunch of genetic material is a non sequitur. It's a worthy goal on its own, but it has little bearing on the original question. Sure, we may be able to use the genetic material to plant new life on another planet, but it doesn't address the responsibility we have to the current life on Mira, which will be extinguished and was Ted's initial concern. If anything, the non sequitur and a comment about logistical problems is an implicit answer in the negative. It's just too difficult to care about these creatures, so we're not going to. We in fact have no moral obligation to the current life on Mira, and if we do, that obligation is sufficiently minuscule as to be dwarfed by the obligation to make sure humanity survives. Xenoblade X never gets around to making this argument explicitly though. Why is that? But hey, at least Ted's satisfied, for some reason. Forget about Mira though, what about Ted? He felt this obligation to Mira was important enough that he was willing to die lest he betray it. Does Xenoblade X think this a respectable outlook? Lin says his perspective deserves attention, so clearly yes. But don't fall into the trap. Look at what she says right after.
Just don't forget there's people looking out for you. You got that, Ted?
The appeal matches the Linley logic we set up earlier. It would be wrong for Ted to stay behind on Mira for the exact same reason it would be wrong for Omomo to stay behind. He would be killing the parts of others who have imprinted onto him. Thus, the only permissible ending to this subplot is one in which Ted agrees to go back to NLA, which naturally he chooses to do so. Am I placing too much weight on Lynn's one-line response? Perhaps. But if you think Xenoblade X feels differently, then I must ask the same question I asked of the Omomo subplot. If the game does think Ted staying behind has merit, why wasn't it willing to show us? Why couldn't Ted stay behind? I'll continue to be insistent on this point because I think Xenoblade X's disinterest in challenging itself highlights the frailty of the original argument. Shosan says, while discussing getting all of the alien communities on board with the second Project Exodus,
Sadly, some of them did respond they're planning to go down with the planet, but most are currently in the process of relocating to NLA.
Okay, so who are these people? What do they feel is so important that they have to stay on Mira? Why doesn't the game show us a single one of them? In a story about choosing to live, isn't it important to understand why some people might decide not to live? After all, how can we possibly argue for the former if we have no solid conception of the latter? Void is emblematic of my problems with the game's approach to moral issues. His motivation is simple. He wants to understand death. Not the process or end state of death, but its gestalt. What is it about the concept of death that provokes such rich emotional reaction? That's certainly an interesting question. Perhaps through Void, we'll come to understand death in a way that the game failed to show us previously. Unfortunately, the game has a rather disappointing answer. Void is quick to assure us that he is driven merely by autonomous analytical function, not desires as we would think. His only goal, as it is to comprehend death, not because of some passion, but merely by intellectual willpower. And for this, the game repeatedly asserts that Void is not to be reasoned with. Don't try to understand Lynn. He can string all the reasons he likes, but when you get down to it, this guy is pure evil. Al's assessment about Void is reaffirmed at the end of Act 2, Elma stating,
No, there's certainly a streak of wickedness in him. He's lonely, insatiable, and curious, too. In a way, he's very pure. But if it ultimately brings him to wish harm upon us, we should call a spade a spade. By any name, his intentions are inscrutable to us, and that's the truth.
Inscrutable. That's quite the pointed word. It's kind of the whole problem I've been alluding to, isn't it? Considering this act has been filled with examples of the game failing to give credence to characters who are willing to die, Void can't help but feel like a reflexive intonation on the game's part. It seems to me the only one here who has been unable to comprehend death thus far is Xenoblade Chronicles X. The reason why the game couldn't directly tackle Omomo's desire for her husband or Ted's commitment to the life on Mira is because the game doesn't know how to. Doesn't understand. These motivations are confusing, nonsensical, inscrutable. Sure, love your husband and appreciate the wildlife, but to choose death for these things? How can you, when you could choose to be living and loving your family instead? Likewise, Xenoblade X does not appreciate Void's quest on a theoretical level. Why should anyone want to comprehend death? Thus, Void is rendered inscrutable. Of course, as we'll see later, Void ends up being far more scrutable than even the game will be willing to admit. Let's take a step back. What is my issue here? It is not the argument Chapter 13 makes. In fact, the argument taken on its own has plenty of merit. For as much as a community has a responsibility to respect the wishes of an individual has a responsibility to respect the wishes of the community they're a part of. And there is a sense in which Omomo electing to stay behind would cause genuine harm to her family members, as Lynn suggests, as I'm sure anyone who's lost a family member can imagine. What I'm surprised by is just how incurious Xenoblade X is to any other perspective on the matter. The game seriously cannot come up with even a single legitimate reason why someone might want to stay behind on Mira. That's kind of laughable, I think. The problem is not that X has strong opinions on things either. It's great when a story has opinions it wants to get across loudly. After all, the original X did not agree with Lau's perspective, on the basis that though Lau had correct grievances, it did not entail punishing people like Lin for the sins of Project Exodus's architects. No, the issue, despite my best efforts, is that I'm still struggling with the degree of the dilemma in Chapter 13. Destroying a planet has such massive implications for so many different reasons, and Chapter 13's very singular-minded approach to the topic doesn't do Mira's destruction the due diligence it deserves, making me less on board with the story's aims on the whole. And I'm hesitant to say that this was only a function of the story being truncated into 3 acts. We could certainly argue that Chapter 13 doesn't understand the economy of the quest, given how many exposition dumps it goes through so quickly. But as I've tried to show with Act 2, a lot of the issues are simply the way in which Chapter 13 utilized its time as is. Chapter 13 simply has inappropriately strong convictions given the enormous complexity of the subject. It's all well and good for Xenoblade X to gesture at the idea of adding nuance, but at some point that nuance needs to materialize somewhere. Sure, family is undoubtedly valuable, but is that really the only thing worth living for? The game can say there are more reasons than this, but it's difficult to take that admission seriously when it's followed by an entire chapter indicating that people who want to stay behind are either self-serving, factually incorrect, or so alien in thought as to be incomprehensible. I'm sorry to say that's not a robust exploration of the will to live. That's a dismissively narrow platitude. Really, I think this best explains why Mira's destruction is so frustrating. It's sad to see Xenoblade X put up such a weak defense for its own beautiful setting. The one thing that people have always said about X is how cool the world is. All of those vistas you spent exploring, wildlife discovered, probes set down, tyrants hunted. Where is the acknowledgement of this? There's not a single scene where a character is able to express any visceral sadness as to what's being lost. On the other hand, Act 2 definitely makes clear nothing on Mira is worth dying for. It's one thing to say that the game wants to make you feel the loss of Mira in the same way the characters within the story do, but that requires making the characters in the story feel the same way I do. Instead, Chapter 13 treats Mira like a trivial afterthought. If you're gonna destroy a planet, at least do it right. Do it well. While it's nice when stories engage deeply with themselves, that's not the only reason I'm so critical of Act 2. There's a direct line between Act 2's unwillingness to explore why someone would choose death, and the brazenly hypocritical conclusion Act 3 leads its characters towards. In doing so, Chapter 13 unwittingly presents one of the strongest counterarguments to its own theme imaginable. Let me ask you something. Is this final scene of the white whale orbiting a new planet a happy ending, or even just a positive one? Certainly, I think the game thinks this is cause for celebration, but I'm asking about you. Do you think this is a positive ending? Before you answer, let me complicate matters a little bit. The reason why Mira was consumed by DMAT events was because of the arrival of the ghosts. The ghosts act as a sort of universal correction system, triggered from the use of the conduit from which the Ares cores are based. So I'm sure you see the problem. Our heroes may have escaped Mira in the nick of time, but as far as they, and we know, their prospects on this new planet won't be any better. It's not at all obvious that Void himself was a necessary component in getting the ghosts to appear. Several times the game states the Ares alone is the cause for the ghosts and the DMAT events. It's possible that the indirect link between Ares, Ganglion, and Ghost was simply the Ganglion's attack to retrieve the Ares, spurring on more conduit-like usage. Not to do some back-of-the-envelope logic, but we know all it took to summon the ghosts the first time was one Sumerian futzing with the cores, and humans are the Sumerians' descendants. Seems like a similar enough recipe. The crew of the White Whale need to think very carefully about what comes next, because they should have every expectation that the ghosts will eventually pop back for the Ares and demat this new planet as well. Seeing how they currently have no plan whatsoever for dealing with the ghosts, all this means is they'll have to start over, again. This ending has barely resolved anything. Hold on, we're not even close to being done here. I've been saying throughout this discussion that Mira gets destroyed, but that's only partially accurate. A lot more than just Mira gets destroyed. Combing over the Ares data, we find out that when the ghosts dematted Earth, they also destroyed the entire universe Earth was a part of. Our being on Mira is not only a journey across space, but a translation across universes. The same was true of Elma when her home planet was destroyed by the ghosts and she left for Earth. Worse yet, leaving Mira for a new universe requires the cores of the Ares, the very same technology that summons the ghosts. In short, the only way to escape the ghosts is the selfsame means that summons them in the first place. Now, I want to take a pause here. I've just said something incredible, something completely horrifying, but I'm not sure we've altogether grasped the nature of it yet. Remember how I was frustrated that Act 2 failed to capture the nuanced viewpoints that might arise from abandoning a world to its destruction? Well, it turns out the scope of my concern was far too small. Forget planets, we need to consider the ethical and moral implications of destroying entire universes. I'm sure it won't be surprising to find there are infinitely more dilemmas here to consider, both in terms of volume and complexity. And if you thought Xenoblade X's handling of the ethics of a single world was inadequate, Xenoblade X's handling of multiple universes is so gobsmackingly indifferent, I'm still having trouble processing it. Imagine all of the life contained in a single universe. Not our universe, we're still working out that one, but the universe is presented by Xenoblade X. Based on our time in Mira, we know of countless different races. Manon, Clurians, Erebogans, Orphi, Rothians, Prone, Definians, Ganglion. The Ganglion exist within the larger Sumerian Federation, whose radius spans 6 million light-years. It would not be an unreasonable assumption to say that a single universe in Xenoblade X is teeming with life. Life which, presumably, would like to keep on living, if Xenoblade X is to be believed. And each time a universe is destroyed, all of that life is wiped out, unceremoniously. For some reason, none of the alien races seem to care that their homes have been destroyed as well. If that's the case, we have to consider what humanity has achieved by escaping Mira, because their decision will have far-reaching consequences. By merely bringing the Ares into a new universe, humanity has now recklessly endangered the lives of the presumably countless trillions of life forms living there. But unlike Mira's universe, where they were blissfully unaware of the ghosts' motives, this time they are not so oblivious. This time, they know what they've done. If events proceed in the manner I've described, and the ghosts return for the Ares cores once again, the white whale will continue to flee to new universes, naturally with the Ares in tow. Meanwhile, the ghosts will demat entire universes, killing all life that resides within, and then follow the white whale's trail. This procedure will play out indefinitely, until either the ghosts best the white whale or the white whale bests the ghosts. But who can say how many countless universes will lie destroyed and disintegrated before that happens? Humanity could choose to destroy the Ares cores, assuming that's even within their capacity to do, in the hope that the ghosts will cease pursuit. But will they really be willing to lose their only form of insurance should things go south again? Will they want to risk losing what is potentially the only access point to their consciousnesses? Will Al be willing to give up his favorite toy? I'm only half joking with that last one. Either way, Chapter 13 never broaches this important topic. I must make it clear that it is irrelevant if they manage to resolve the ghost problem immediately, without jumping to any more universes, or if the ghosts never show up at all. Suppose for the sake of argument that the planet the white whale finds itself on at the end of the game is the same planet shown in Future Redeemed. Then in Xenoblade 4, all of our favorite characters pool their knowledge to beat up the ghosts and everyone lives happily ever after. The thing is, to properly examine the morality of the white whale's decision here, we have to analyze the situation prospectively, not retrospectively. The humans, at least from what is shown in X, have no reason to believe the scenario in which they managed to beat the ghosts in Universe 1 is significantly more likely than the scenario in which they managed to beat the ghosts in Universe 27. If the former happens, from the human's perspective, it will be pure chance that events played out this way. The same logic applies if the ghosts just so happen not to badger them again. But the question we need to ascertain is whether they are morally in the right to take that chance in the first place. Because I'm sure you'll agree that the gamble humanity is making on others' behalf is staggering, toppling even. I have not gone down this rabbit hole just for the sake of it. These considerations pose a thematic problem for Chapter 13. What is the game's ultimate conclusion about Void's crusade to comprehend death? He wanted to view death from afar because he himself was scared of dying. He wanted survival at the cost of all else, everything and everyone.
He was afraid that he himself might disappear. And so he ran away. From Samar's descendants, the ghosts, from all the forces that wanted to erase him, he ran and ran. And at the end of his long road, he knew death for the first time.
Why did humanity flee Mira again? Because they wanted to run away from the force trying to erase them, to avoid understanding death, so they could have a third chance at life. Isn't this a selfish choice? Isn't this exactly the same behavior the game criticizes Void for doing? If I were living on whatever this planet is, I'd be pretty livid if a bunch of fools came barging in from another universe, bringing with them the risk of ghost incursions. But I guess it's only a problem when the ganglion brings doom and destruction to someone else's doorstep.
Escape is much more active than acceptance. By continuing to flee, I will ensure my existence alone will be out.
Perpetual avoidance? What's the point?
Hey Al might want to pick up the phone. The call appears to be coming from inside the house. Wait a moment though, we know exactly why the game doesn't seem to think there's a contradiction here. Why is it that, in the end, Void must learn to accept death? Everyone else in Chapter 13 has been asked to live, so why shouldn't Void learn to love living as well? You might think that sounds like a silly question. Void has been carelessly destroying life wherever he finds it. Surely that needs to be stopped. But that's not the reason it's okay for Void to accept death. We've forgotten about the Linley logic established in Act 2. Think about how the game characterizes Void. He's lonely, secluded, alone and fine with it. Al later describes him as hollow and empty. Empty because Void contains no other souls inside him. Void is the exception to Al's no soul exists in isolation. Because Void exists in isolation, no one has been able to imprint a piece of their soul within him. Therefore, Void does not have the same duty to life that Omomo or Ted have. Void's death will not result in the killing of any other person's soul, and his lack of interest in removing himself from isolation means his attempts to flee death are ignoble, shameful, and selfish. Meanwhile, humanity has an infinite hunger for connection. Every new place they visit, they meet new people, expanding the number of souls imprinted onto them. Each time they flee, humanity slowly collates all the souls of the universe, making it one step closer to true enlightenment. Humanity must continue because they have so much lust for life, love for the world and each other. It is humanity's passion for all of creation that makes their fleeing death permissible and Void's less so. That's it. That's the reason. Aren't you guys so convinced by this game's argument? I'm happy Al manages to help the white whale reach a path to heaven, because I'm pretty sure these people will be burning in hell after this. I am not necessarily asking Xenoblade X to say that humanity should just sit on Mira and accept death. But I am asking Xenoblade X to at least consider the possibility. Lao asks Lin to live, but that choice cannot exist in a vacuum. Choose to live in the face of what? It's one thing to acknowledge that humanity is corrupt and disgusting, but that acknowledgement cannot then become a blank check for any and all behavior. Ted perfectly spelled out the dilemma in Act 2. That just by arriving on Mira, humans irrevocably damaged the world they wanted to inhabit. So why does Act 3 completely forgo this reasoning? Doesn't it recognize that humanity could be on the precipice of inflicting the same damage elsewhere just by arriving on this new planet? Chapter 13 gives it no thought. If you are not on that white whale, you do not factor into the game's moral calculus. And so I am once again left with the same question I had for Xenoblade 3. Is there no price too high for humanity? If preserving the future of our species involves wagering several universes worth of life along the way, maybe choosing to live is the wrong choice. So, is this a happy ending? 'Cause I'm not convinced. I am convinced, however, that the moral questions I've been hand-wringing over for so long do matter to Xenoblade. In some sense, they matter the most. The entire premise of 2 is that Klaus felt he needed to pay recompense for the world he helped destroy. Future Redeemed begged Niall to consider the moral foundations of the world she wanted to create. Lest we forget, Lau's entire thing was being upset about the ethics of Project Exodus. But when their endings start to play in the realm of negation, as Xenoblade 3 and X do, well, look at the monster we've had to untangle our way through because of it. A story about choosing to live and the duty to life and the differences between Void and humanity would have been perfectly fine if they hadn't felt the need to throw in planet-annihilating, multiversal mass death as a treat. And make no mistake, it is supposed to be a treat. I would be totally on board with Mira's destruction if I felt that was a natural consequence of what the story demanded, such as Torna the Golden Country, and not a transparent pretext for Xenoblade X to better position the characters within the larger cinematic universe the series is building up. They gave the cast a ship that travels the multiverse, for crying out loud. At any point in time in any game, the White Whale could swoop in to make a last-second appearance, should they want to make that happen. And I would be shocked if this game wasn't setting up the ghosts as some larger threat. The one moment that crystallizes my feelings on Chapter 13 is this terrible scene with Void upon first entering Volataris. The characters are all debating what death means, but it plays out less like people with informed points of view, and more like empty vessels engaging in philosophical diarrhea. It's also vague and abstract and ephemeral. Why not have this same debate by rooting it in specific situations that arise organically throughout the story? It's almost like there was an entire chapter of the video game designed to do that. Where's the power in this scene? Al's rebuttal has all the weight and gravitas of Captain Kirk short-circuiting a computer with basic propositional logic.
You, Void. You simply refuse to learn.
There is not in all existence I cannot learn.
Cat's out of the bag. That right there is the proof of your ignorance. You don't even know that you don't know. And since you're unable to accept that truth, you just went and declared yourself the loser.
Intolerable.
You are flawed and imperfect. And you have not corrected by sterilization. You have made 3 errors.
Error.
I had thought Xenoblade 3 was supposed to be the ending to a trilogy, a chance for the series to put to rest some well-worn concepts and march on to new things. But here comes Chapter 13, and now it feels like we're staring down the barrel of another story which will be recycling near-identical ideas, exploring them in near-identical ways. The novelty of Xenoblade games crossing over with each other is beginning to wear razor thin. What is this flood of cosmological mumbo-jumbo really adding in the grand scheme? What ideas do the conduit or the ghosts or the rivers of consciousness contribute that weren't already thoroughly explored by the likes of Xenoblade 1, 2, or 3? I guess it's less a question of what the series can say than what they'll be willing to say. But if Chapter 13 is supposed to be a proving ground, I've come away from it feeling thoroughly underwhelmed. It's a little ironic that a series which consistently reminds us to look towards the future cannot seem to free itself from perpetually regurgitating concepts that originate from a 2 decades old PS2 trilogy or older. Maybe Xenoblade should take its own advice and move on. This epilogue has made me think about why I was so drawn to the series in the first place. Since 2014, no less, over a decade. My mind frequently returns to this one scene at the beginning of Xenoblade 2, where Nia asks Rex why he became a salvager. Rex says it's because he believes that if there's an entrance to Elysium anywhere, it's below the Cloud Sea. Elysium has the power to solve all the world's problems: famine, war, poverty. Rex believes he can make a real lasting difference in the world if he puts his mind to it. Nia can only laugh at the naivete of his explanation, yet even she can't deny there's something alluring in Rex's words. That someone would speak of a world for everyone, given that people like Rex have been all too happy to have a world that would subjugate people like her. It's a great scene, a scene that strikes at the central conflict of Xenoblade 2, whether Rex's conception of an Elysium is possible at a theoretical level. Famine, war, poverty, aren't these simply inevitable, intractable problems born from the human condition? If so, Elysium cannot possibly exist. It gives us insight into the two opposing philosophies the game will wrestle with, in a conversation where two characters have discernible, tangible reasons for why they believe what they do. It's scenes like this that make Xenoblade an exciting series to play, that make me curious to know more. I can't say I'm at all curious to learn more about the ghosts, or a nexus of parallel universes. So I have to hand it to Monolith Soft. Chapter 13?
I absolutely do not comprehend.
Xenoblade Chronicles X is one of my favorite games. This remains the case. It will be easy to divorce my feelings on Chapter 13 from the rest of the game. I'll probably just write some fanfiction ending in my head and make my own fun that way. Xenoblade X is a game that manages to hold on to the moment. Though I never found the time to replay it on the Wii U, I would boot it up from time to time to just wander. Not complete quests or fight enemies, just roam. Fly around Primordia as the rain falls, hear the footsteps on the grounds of NLA, witness the Aurora Borealis light up the night sky in Sylvalum. Over 100 hours exploring its corners, I was confident Mira had remained just as captivating as it was in Hour 1. I could have spent more time there. Despite everything, I'm glad Definitive Edition gave me a chance to do just that.